Among the most important tasks for a young child is the development of executive functions, or cognitive skills that lead them to a sense of agency and control over their choices and actions. Today we will review the ARC framework, introduce crucial executive function skills, and learn an intervention that can aid in helping to delay reactive responses, as well as to actively evaluate and problem solve to increase effective decision making. Blaustein and Kinneberg, in the book Treating Traumatic Stress in Children and Adolescents, share the three core domains of the ARC treatment framework that we've been referencing together, which are attachment, self-regulation, and competency. This last domain, competency, is a crucial piece of overcoming the effects of early trauma and is what we will be focusing on today. Looking at the image here, what are some characteristics this person would need to possess to have the courage to be able to jump a gap like that? In the article exploring the mechanisms of self-control and improvement, Inslicht and colleagues describe the prefrontal cortex as the part of the brain that governs our thinking and concentration, as well as our attention span, judgment, planning, impulse control, follow-through, and empathy. Some have called it the captain of the cognitive ship, or said it's similar to an air traffic controller, as you see here in the picture, because it also controls your ability to analyze situations, organize your thoughts, and plan or carry out your plans. We can also think of it as the brain's boss or CEO, or like the bottom picture, it would be the cop in the rearview mirror, which reminds you to push down the brake at times, helping you to think about what you say and do before you say it. The core building blocks of the ARC model are shown here, and Blaustein and Kinneberg identify them as caregiver effect management, attunement, consistent response, routines and rituals, affect identification, and affect modulation, as well as expression, some of which we've already been talking about. The last two, or the two closest to the second to the last, are developmental competency, which encompasses those two building blocks, executive functions and self-development and identity. And these are both core areas of focus, especially when treating children exposed to early developmental trauma. So what are executive functions? They are those skills that are held in the prefrontal cortex that allow us to exert control over our actions. Though there are many, the 5 skills of executive function that we will review and that are talked about extensively in Blaustein and Kinneberg's book, which have been highlighted by these researchers, are delaying responses, active decision making, anticipating consequences, evaluating outcomes, and finally, generating alternative solutions. The frontal lobe, as you see here in this picture, seen highlighted in blue, is also responsible for much of the executive functioning in the brain. Blaustein and Kinneberg also state that the limbic system, which you can see here highlighted in the center part of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, again you can see the arrow in the top right, are mutually inhibitory. They say that as one increases in activation, the other decreases, and vice versa, as you can see with the arrows to the right, one going up as the other goes down. Consider the way in which frustration, for instance, interferes with your ability to remain focused on a difficult task and continue to work towards a solution. As your arousal goes up, cognitive processes begin to fragment. And conversely, consider the ways in which your thinking brain, example, focusing on logic or breaking tasks into step-by-step solutions, can help decrease feelings of being overwhelmed. That is, the act of harnessing higher order cognitions, which can serve to regulate arousal levels. So for children who experience chronic trauma, The ongoing exposure to danger, both real and perceived, takes a toll on the development of higher cognitive abilities and presents a problem. They have increased sensitization to danger signals, making them frequently ready to run, and therefore prioritizing limbic over prefrontal activation. We talked about flight, fight, or running, and also freezing. Because there are so many potential triggers of danger, these children may be as likely to be in limbic control in the midst of math class as they would be in the midst of a jungle running from a tiger, for example. So always on edge. In the absence of higher cognitive control found in our prefrontal cortex, these children are caught in stimulus response mode. Life throws something at them, and their first response is to react. So how can we help? Research indicates that children who have experienced trauma lag behind their peers over time in development of the following age-appropriate executive function skills. So by increasing executive function skills, we as caregivers can bring conscious through our actions, or conscious thought rather, to our actions, allowing us to consider our actions in context rather than simply reacting. One of the executive function skills we must intentionally help children impacted by trauma to improve is their ability to delay or inhibit response. For example, if you're speeding down a road and suddenly see a stop sign, or for example, the caution sign you can see on the right of the screen asking us to beware of ducks and turtles crossing the road, what are they meant to help us do? That's right. And similarly, we want to help those we work with who are stuck in their reacting brain to pause or stop and get out of the cycle of automatic reactions and limbic system control, and help them move into their thinking or rational part of the brain, as we've just been talking about. Next, we need to encourage active decision making. As caregivers, we can pay close attention and help the child to recognize choice situations, either in anticipation of the situation or by processing them after the choice has been made. It's important to reinforce positive choices as well as any attempts that a caregiver notices as well. What's the difference between these two images that you see? Yeah, one person is getting soaked, the one on the left, but the other on the right, the difference is she thought ahead and brought her umbrella. So both are experiencing the same situation, but with two different outcomes due to a difference in anticipation. Helping a child learn to anticipate consequences is also an important executive function skill. At times, this may be best facilitated by allowing the child to suffer the consequences of their own choices as well, which can be difficult sometimes. This leads us into the final executive functioning skill highlighted by Blaustein and Kinneberg, which is evaluating the choice that was made along with its outcome. And finally, after experiencing certain consequences of their choices, it's important to help the child begin to think through and generate alternative choices and solutions whenever possible. For example, the photo on the left talks about having an idea, and that idea moving into a plan. And then that plan, after articulated or written down, can move on into action. Improving executive functions helps a child to navigate through the world in a more goal-directed and thoughtful way, as reiterated by Blaustein and Kinneberg again in their book. They also help us to regulate our attention to do one thing or multiple things simultaneously. Intact executive functions increase the child's ability to take new information, then pull it together with things they've already known from the past to form new ideas, and to therefore begin to have the ability to move on into solving problems. For children exposed to chronic trauma, which are many of those that we work with, research demonstrates that there's often impaired executive functioning abilities as compared with other children their same age. Pat Horenzik, along with his colleagues, as well as Plum and colleagues, share in their research that what happens to you, for example, on the inside when you hear a fire alarm, is that when children are exposed to trauma, they experience regular engagement of this alarm mode in their brains. So when we hear a fire alarm, some of the things that happen are our anxiety rises, our heart rate goes up, there are different thoughts, there is again that fight, flight, or freeze. And so this gets activated. And this often leads to inadequate development of prefrontal controls when this exposure occurs over and over and over for a child. In their research on executive functioning and PTSD, McDonald and colleagues' recent research shows that resilient youth show positive outcomes when they're able to demonstrate problem-solving skills and the ability to make choices effectively. These abilities allow them to be active participants and decision makers in their own lives rather than waiting for others to do this for them. In their research, in addition to that, Lee, Bull, and Ho share that for many people, the problem-solving steps are unconscious, rapid processes used to assess situations and make various choices, which is what happens for many of us. But as we said earlier, though, when children have been exposed to repetitive trauma, or just even an instance of trauma, these steps can often be skipped, and they move unconsciously straight into reaction. So the goal then is to make this unconscious process conscious by building a child's awareness of choice. The caregiver's goal and our goal is to help the child, youth, or adult to develop problem-solving skills by providing enough practice and comfort level with each step so they can then be applied and generalized to any given situation. Caregivers need to help children problem solve and generate and implement solutions, which in turn help the children to grow in the most important executive function tasks of both control and agency. Agency is the knowledge that one has the ability to not only act, but thus make an impact on the world. We eventually want the youth we worked with to be able to use problem-solving skills in the moment, rather than just in the context of treatment. Blaustein and Kinneberg also report from their research that the likelihood of this generalization will significantly increase if the caregivers are able to, 1, recognize when the child is needing to solve a problem, and then 2, cue the child to evaluate their options and make a choice. And following this up by 3, supporting the child's attempt to make active choices and responding to those without judgment. In addition, caregivers have an opportunity to model and support a calm approach to problem solving, or simply model remaining calm in the face of that problem or stressor. By responding to behavior in a consistent manner, either by offering praise and reinforcement, or by offering limits and enforcing consequences, the caregiver teaches important lessons to the children or adolescents or adults about choice and agency. The first 3 crucial steps to increase problem-solving skills are to notice that there's a problem. And this takes evaluating and paying attention, especially to emotional alarms or flags that go off. Number 2, establish basic safety and inhibit instinctive danger responses that we've learned about earlier, thus helping the child to evaluate, am I actually in danger in this moment? Again, moving from limbic system activation to prefrontal cortex activation. Next, we must identify and try to understand the problem. After this, a child can move into brainstorming, where we help them to identify possible solutions. The key here is no matter what the idea, not to throw this out. Don't throw anything out at this stage. Number 4, we need to help youth to evaluate all of the possible consequences, both good and bad, of each solution, and then make the best choice. And the final step is to both implement and then evaluate those solutions that have been chosen, and then revise those choices as needed. Our ultimate goal is to increase a child's awareness of choices and the capacity to actively make them to help reach a goal. Here on the slide are a few questions to consider engaging a child with after a problem-solving process has taken place, and this will continue to build and reinforce these executive function skills. So the first 3 questions really get at the process and asking the child how that went for them. The third question talks about the decision. What made you pick choice 1 rather than choice 2? Again, really allowing them to dig deep into their thought process of making those decisions. And then lastly, the 2 questions get at the outcome. So once you've made the decision and there was an outcome, how well did you think that went? Can you think of anything that would have made this turn out better or worse? So again, engaging that prefrontal cortex. One of the behavior trauma therapies that's been extensively researched is dialectic behavioral therapy, which is DBT, and this was developed by Marcia Linehan. How many of you have ever become overwhelmed with emotion and have reacted in a negative way that upon looking back you wish you could have done differently? One of the DBT evidence-based techniques that can help us and children to tolerate distress and get through a difficult situation without making it worse is developing a pros and cons matrix. This intervention, seen throughout the literature with Linehan as well as with Rocco and Bies and others who have talked about just pros and cons and really, again, getting back at that prefrontal cortex functioning, again, is the pros and cons matrix. And so this intervention allows a child to pause and resist urges to react or act impulsively and actively begin to problem solve. Many of us actually do this automatically all the time in our minds. For example, when your alarm goes off at 5 a.m., what are some of your automatic thoughts? Are you thinking of any consequences or the positives or negative reasons for actually getting out of bed versus hitting the snooze button one more time or maybe even for the 5th time? What are some of those? Pros and cons can help us to resist urges and to act impulsively or to do things that are destructive, particularly when we're in an emotional mind. Pros and cons can also help us resist urges to quit and to give up on life. And they can help us resist actions such as using drugs, or binging on those last 2 pieces of chocolate cake, or having angry outbursts at others, for an example. Why is it important to engage in making a pros and cons list? It seems so simple. But the goal is for the person to see that accepting reality and tolerating distress lead to better outcomes than do rejecting reality and refusing to tolerate distress. This skill consists of thinking about the positive and negative aspects both of acting and not acting on crisis behavior urges. And as we said before, those of us with our executive functions intact actually use the pros and cons many times throughout each day. The matrix you see here on the screen is offered again by Linehan, and this will allow us to help those those with trauma who have difficulty with executive functions list out the pros or advantages as well as the cons or disadvantages, both of resisting and giving in to those reactive urges. We want to do this multiple times before overwhelming urges hit to prepare us to be able to react from our prefrontal cortex. Such rehearsal makes it likely that the pros of avoiding destructive behavior and the cons of engaging in destructive behavior will pop into your mind when needed. The idea here, as you can see in the matrix, is to get thinking about the long-term benefits of avoiding destructive behavior to become stronger, and thinking about immediate benefits of destructive behavior to become weaker. By looking at the consequences of our actions, researchers show that it can help us bring awareness and control back to our frontal cortex, allowing us to process and problem solve to come up with the best solutions. When we do this particular worksheet, we want to look at all of the following to help us or the youth make an informed decision. And so this can be about any issue in which someone's feeling stuck or unable to decide, or frustrated with certain automatic reactions. So I'm going to hand out a matrix to each of you. And so the parts of the matrix, as you look at it, are first of all the scenario. So the scenario goes in the top left. And for this example, we're going to use lashing out or reacting by someone or screaming at them in anger in response. So this matrix explores the pros or advantages of going with this reactive decision. And that goes in the upper left square. The cons or disadvantages of going with this reactive decision, so actually screaming at someone or bursting out in anger, goes in the upper right square. The pros of not going with or resisting this reactive decision, so resisting the crisis urge, goes in the lower left square. And the cons, again, of not going with this action, so choosing to not scream or lash out, go into the bottom right. So initially, it may seem like that box 1 and 4, so the top left and the bottom right, and the bottom left and the top right, box 2 and 3, are similar, or these ideas are repetitive. And actually they are. Opposite, but very similar. And so what we find is that when students list reasons from each of these perspectives, they come up with more insights to help them make a more well-rounded, or wise-minded, as many researchers call it, a decision. Upon completion of the matrix, remind the youth to keep this worksheet somewhere where they can see it often, and it can be very hard to remember why not to engage in crisis behaviors when they're in that emotional or reaction mind. So to review where we've come from today, we discussed a problem, which is that trauma negatively impacts the development of executive function skills. And this can keep us in a cycle of unhelpful crisis reacting. The key for us as caregivers is to recognize, model, and reinforce problem-solving steps to increase these executive functioning skills. One practical way we will have shown to do this is by using the DBT evidence-based intervention that we just went over, called the pros and cons matrix. And just by way of reminder, this allows us to help others focus on long-term goals, see the light at the end of the tunnel, and remember times when their pain has ended. Think of the positive consequences of tolerating distress, having an opportunity to imagine in their mind how good it will feel to achieve their goals if they don't react on this crisis impulsivity. And then thinking of all the negative consequences of not tolerating the current distress. And finally, it allows those participating to remember what has happened in the past when they acted impulsively just to escape the moment. By repetitively allowing the prefrontal cortex to increase activation, the youth will eventually increase their sense of control. And over time, they will be increasingly aware of their improved executive functioning, allowing them the ability to problem solve, make active choices, and ultimately to function independently, which will all be essential building blocks, back to the beginning slide that we looked at, to their continued lifelong resilience. These last few slides will show some additional resources, and so please feel free to ask any clarifying questions at this time. And thank you for considering all that we've just shared.